When the going gets tough, throw your advisors under the bus. That seems to be the approach the government is taking to cover their backs over the decisions which led the UK to have the highest death toll in Europe, or that's what seems most likely. So later in the show, I'll be discussing that story with reference to some clips of Therese Coffey, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. She did some disastrous interviews this morning where she tried to lay blame on the scientists. Then later in the day, at the daily press conference, the scientists fought back. So I'm going to talk you through that very dramatic interchange there. After that, I'll be talking to the economist and friend of the show, Pfizers Shaheen, about the latest unemployment figures and new research from her think tank Class on how deep the corona crisis could go. But first, I'm delighted to be joined by someone who has become one of the country's most prominent critics of the government's approach to coronavirus. John Ashton is a doctor and academic who was Director of Public Health for Cumbria for 13 years before being elected President of the Faculty of Health, a position he held until 2016. John, thank you for joining us on today's show.
Good to be with you, Michael. It was Northwest, actually, for 13, but there you go.
Oh, it was? Well, you need to edit your Wikipedia then.
I know, they've been editing it for me. The government people have been editing it for me and putting all sorts of slanderous things in.
Oh, well, my apologies. They've tricked me. They've tricked me already.
Yeah. You have to look at my wiki with a pinch of salt.
Okay, I'll do that for next time. Before we start the interview, tweet on the hashtag #TiskiSour and share the show link. We want to get more people watching this show. So, John, I want to focus today's conversation on whether the government will be able to learn from mistakes it has made so far and thus avoid making them again. But to introduce this topic, I want to first dispel an idea which is pretty widespread in the corporate press, which is that you shouldn't criticize the government because it's all too easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to say what has gone wrong. And I'm going to dispel that myth with a clip of John Ashton speaking over 2 months ago on the 12th of March edition of BBC Question Time. Let's take a look.
I don't know where to start, really. I mean, I'm embarrassed by the situation in this country. You know, this talk of 4 stages, and we're now, moving on from the containment thing. We've lost the plot here. We haven't taken the action that we should have taken 4 or 5 weeks ago.
So what do you think we should have done?
Boris Johnson should have convened COBRA at the outset when it became clear what was cooking up. Countries that took firm action at the time, if you look at what's happened in Hong Kong and Singapore, which had a lot of cases initially, but which took firm action, and they've got the thing under control. We've lost control here. Last night, I didn't go to Anfield last night because, I had such second thoughts about it. 3,000 supporters came to Anfield last night from Madrid, where they're playing football behind closed doors. The virus is around in Madrid. We've had that virus has been shared around Merseyside last night in the bars and clubs of Merseyside. The virus is no doubt now among us for reasons which are totally obscure to me. We've taken it as policy not to track the people who've come back from Italy, not to test the people who've come back from Italy. So the virus will now be amongst us.
So I remember when that clip first came out. I often watch the clips instead of the whole show, but it got very widely shared. But also you got lots of attacks. So lots of people saying, why have the BBC got this populist on the television? He's politically motivated. This isn't about public health. But it turns out your quite grim predictions have basically turned out to be very accurate. And that point you were specifically making about that Liverpool match, that's now, a bit of a national scandal that's been brought up at the daily press conferences. I mean, I want to start with the question of why did you see what was coming and the government didn't? Sort of, what's your explanation for their slowness to realize the gravity of this situation?
Well, I've been around the block a few times. I've been in public health for over 40 years. I worked at regional, national and international level, and I've had to deal with the avian flu, the swine flu, the SARS, was involved also with the Ebola on the sidelines. And we've all been expecting that sooner or later there would be another pandemic. Early on, I was involved in commenting on it when the folk came back from Wuhan, and that got me thinking about it. And I issued a warning in that very first interview with Sky on the 1st of February. And I said, we've got to really get on top of this. There's no prizes here. You'll get blamed if you get it right and you get blamed if you get it wrong, because it's like the millennial bug, where we spent a lot of money worried about the computers going down on the 31st of December 1999. And when they didn't, everyone said, what a waste of money. And I said, it'll be like this. You've got to get on top of it. And when I went to Bahrain, the Crown Prince saw me on Sky News and wanted me to come out and forensically criticize what they were doing, which is what I did in February. And I identified that they didn't have enough capacity for testing. And that very same day, I got the Crown Prince and the Supreme Health Council to sign off an order for getting more PCR testing machines and all the rest of the kit that you need. Now, that was at the very point when what should have been happening here was that the Prime Minister should have been convening COBRA, should have been standing back, should have been seeing what needed to happen, would have realised we had all these weaknesses and lacks of capacity and got on top of it. But it never happened, and we wasted February. So when I went on Question Time that night, I was just, back from my second visit to Bahrain, where they'd done everything I said they should do, which is incredibly flattering for me, because I gave them a list of about 15 things to do after my first visit, and they did them all. And, now here we are 3 or 4 months in. It's a small country, but they had quite complex problems. They had a lot of religious pilgrims who'd been to Iran, to the holy sites, and come back testing positive. They've been testing relatively, comparison-wise, far more than Wales for a small country. They've had several thousand cases. They've had 8 deaths, and they're totally on top of it. And so my frustration at seeing what you need to do, how to do it, was boiling over that night on Question Time. And I was being patronised by the chairman. I was being patronised by the Conservative minister. And, I was just so frustrated, it all boiled over.
Do you think the government in any way have recognised their errors, in the sense that potentially they got advice from too small a pool of people, that they weren't open enough to the advice from SAGE being criticised, and sort of bringing in a broader set of voices? Do you see any change on the part of the government, or are they just as hostile to outsiders as they always were?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, to know what's going on in those circles. I think, generally speaking, both with the politicians and the advisors, there seems to have been a lot of groupthink going on. I mean, that closed circle's too closed. It's always a danger of power, is believing your own rhetoric and believing people who are sycophantic close to you. That's been the function of the Joker in Shakespearean courts, is to bring, insight from outside that might be unwelcome, really. And, successful administrations have somebody like myself there to say the uncomfortable things. But it looks as though early on, the advisors weren't offering them that kind of advice. I mean, I think the rumblings over the last week from the 1922 committee, what one reads about these closed social media accounts involving Conservative members of Parliament, they're getting very restless. And, when you ask the question, are they capable of getting on top of this?
Oh, I think we've lost John for a second there. Hopefully we'll be able to sort out that connection in a moment. Although, actually, this gives me a good chance to show a different clip, which I was going to to introduce the next part of our conversation, which is about sort of whether the politicians and also the scientists are learning from the mistakes which have been made over the previous phase of coronavirus, and whether that will be brought into this next phase. Oh, we got you back? I'm going to show this clip while we get you back properly. So this is Professor Edmonds, who was one of the most high-profile members of SAGE, who was back in March going on the television, the same time you were on Question Time, John, talking about how herd immunity was the only possible option, and anyone who talked about a different strategy was deluded, was sort of the impression he gave. And I came across this clip. It's actually from a couple of weeks ago, but I came across it yesterday on Twitter, and I just found it really phenomenal, because there was just a complete refusal to admit that any mistakes were made in the past. And I do find that quite worrying in terms of whether or not we can trust this still quite closed and secretive group of scientists to come up with reflective, more critical strategies in the future. Let's go to that clip now of Professor John Edmonds speaking on Channel 4 News.
I mean, did you change your mind on herd immunity?
No.
What is your...
I don't know what you mean by that. Herd immunity is just a thing. Yeah, herd immunity or population immunity is what
But for a period in March, the government appeared to be pursuing a strategy of mitigating the spread of the virus, allowing Cheltenham races, for example, to go ahead between March the 10th and March the 13th, allowing it to spread naturally, to allow the development of some herd immunity. Was that a mistake?
I don't know. I'm not quite sure whether that really was the strategy. I think that at the time it was difficult to imagine, we weren't sure by what levels of compliance with various social distance measures were possible.
Was that why you didn't model full lockdown until the middle of March?
I think it was very hard. I don't think anybody looked at it. It wasn't just myself. I don't think anybody. We all looked at a range of different measures, some of which were very stringent. But it was, it's difficult to say, but it was difficult to imagine just how, well, in some sense, it was difficult to imagine just how easy the lockdown was.
So that clip there, I mean, I should also say, obviously that's an edited down clip. It's a 20-minute long interview. I recommend you go and watch the whole thing. Just type in Channel 4 News interviews John Edmonds on YouTube. He's slightly more articulate than that clip makes out. But the message is absolutely, that's what he was saying. So he was someone who was on, again, you can look up these videos on the internet. I think we showed them on the show before, actually, of him saying that we're going to have to go for herd immunity. There's no point in having an early lockdown because that's a defunct strategy which involves trying to suppress the virus completely. We can't do that unless there are no cases of coronavirus across the entire world. Obviously, it hadn't yet dawned on them the possibility that you could quarantine new entrants to the country. And I don't want to blame these particular scientists. I think this would be, politically a terrible idea to blame these particular scientists because it's ultimately the government that makes those decisions. But also, if these scientists were using defunct assumptions, so their assumption was that a lockdown would never be politically acceptable, so we'd have to go for herd immunity, then that science should have been published. It should have been open to full and thorough scrutiny, and then maybe those mistakes would have been realized before they cost thousands of lives. But it does make me pretty worried, actually, that these people who are still on SAGE cannot admit their mistakes. If people like these SAGE members and also politicians, will have seen Matt Hancock do the same thing. So he's often, you'll have seen him many times on the TV saying the strategy never changed. We always adopted the same strategy. And if they admitted that, yes, we made a mistake, we adopted this strategy because we were following a plan we had for flu. Yes, if we had entered lockdown 2 weeks earlier, we would have had less deaths. We apologize for that. We are learning from that. And we are going to change our practices because of that, potentially making SAGE more transparent, bringing more critics like John Ashton on board. Then I would be much, much more confident that they are going to be able to manage the next phase of this crisis in a safer way, in a way that costs less lives than they managed the last. And I mean, it's also worth saying that's why I have absolute sympathy with the teachers when they say we want advice published into why we should go back to work, why it's safe to have children back at school. We're not going to take your word for it. We're not going to take the government's word for it because we know that they have acted on and pushed forward false advice as completely objective and unquestionable. And so the idea that advice should be published is absolutely the bare minimum. We've got you back, John. So I think.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. Did you see the clip and hear what I was saying?
No, missed it
No.
all.
It doesn't matter. The theme basically was to what extent, the government moving forward and the scientists in particular. So I showed a clip of John Edmonds, who was denying that herd immunity was ever the plan. And so my question is, to what extent that reluctance to correct for past mistakes and to admit past mistakes means that we might leave the lockdown making exactly the same mistakes as we did going into it. So it cited also this idea that we're telling teachers to go back into school even without publishing the advice, not putting it forward for proper scrutiny by people like yourselves.
We're in a very hazardous situation here. You know, the most dangerous times on an airplane flight are takeoff and landing. And it's the same with an epidemic like this. You know, the early days were messed up. We had this euphoria at the end of January, beginning of February, around the Brexit legislation going through, which seems to have distracted attention of the government from what was coming with the pandemic. It's very interesting because the same thing happened with the United States with the global influenza in 1918-19, when Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, was so preoccupied with getting into the war with Germany and waging war with Germany that he ignored all the warnings about what was cooking up in the army mobilization camps across America where the influenza virus was brewing. And it's a very interesting parallel about how you've got a preoccupation of government not taking notice of something that's cooking up. I think, you know, the hubris of the ministers, politicians believing their own rhetoric, advisors being flattered by being so close to government, a new CMO only in post for 2 or 3 months, perhaps not feeling his strength, being able to challenge government, which is what the chief medical officer should do. And the other advisors, they need to be robustly independent. And we saw that wasn't happening. I think where we are now, you know, it's not the landing. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen in terms of a second wave, or whether what's going to happen now is that this first wave might get extended and exacerbated because of the premature lockdown before we've really bottomed the very extensive testing and tracing that needs to be in place. And we still haven't sorted out personal protection. But, you know, this is the equivalent to the dangerous bit of landing an aeroplane, but actually it's doing it in a state of chaos and anarchy. I think the rumblings within the Conservative Party are going to be very interesting here, because if nothing else, the Conservative Party has an incredible survival instinct, and we'll see what happens politically if this administration continues to stumble from error to trying to cover up and reinterpret and retell the story. But I'm minded of the quote from Winston Churchill, who said of the Americans, they always do the right thing after they've tried everything else first. And I think what we might see here is that eventually, for survival purposes of the Conservative Party, they will do the right thing, and they will, but they need to. The time is short because the price that we're all going to pay in terms of tens of thousands of deaths that were avoided, maybe we will finish up with 2 or 3 times as many deaths as would have happened if we'd really done the right thing at the right time, in the right way, and yes, following the right science.
And I want to ask a question from your experience as a director of public health. So in terms of, the scandal really that there's been with testing, part of it is that the government seemed to be taking advice where you give up on testing, after the virus is widespread enough, which seemed odd in itself. But I want to focus on the more operational side. So why do you think it has taken the government so long to roll out testing, which brings back results in a timely fashion? Is because also we're sort of starting to see people blame Public Health England and saying it's an inefficient system, which is incapable of being flexible enough for a crisis like this. From your experience working at the top of public health, what's your analysis of what's going wrong there?
Well, Public Health England is a disaster area. It's a dysfunctional organisation. It's over-centralised. It's presided over the attrition of local and regional public health. So we didn't have the capacity to do the testing and tracing, and that was the first thing. But the litany is 10 years of austerity, which has run down the service, run down the capacity. Public health departments are now half or a third the size they were. They haven't got their pairs of hands. They haven't got the authority. A lot of local directors of public health are actually line managed by directors of adult social care. They're not a first line executive on the board of a local authority. The links with the health service between public health in the town hall and public health in the health service is weak. So that's been the major backcloth to all of this. Then the Brexit thing, taking the eye off the ball, the personality of the Prime Minister, his general approach to life, his extreme libertarian instincts, which means that even in a crisis, you don't get a grip. You leave it to individuals, and that's not what the purpose of government is. And the primary purpose of government, function of government, is to protect its citizens. And that means you have to take some pretty severe measures on occasion, which was also why I was saying at the very beginning, it was important to fully engage with the public, to be open and transparent, to share the data, because we were going to have to take the public on a difficult journey, which might have, led to the lockdown. How do you manage when you've got people dying at home because there isn't capacity in the hospital?
Oh, I think we've lost John again. I
Sorry.
spoke too soon. Okay, go. Yeah, go on.
What I was about to say was they created the capacity in the hospitals by emptying out 30% of the beds and moving infected people into care homes, and also people being in the community, in their own households, being infected and spreading the infection there. So, this primary goal of stopping the National Health Service falling over had consequences because they hadn't thought through about the care homes and about the community side. And how do you really make sure that there's biosecurity in everybody's household?
I've got my final question for you, John, and I'm really hoping the internet is going to survive this one. And this is about you personally and your experience of sort of criticizing the government and putting your voice out there. I mean, I know you've come under a lot of attack because of this, and people call you, a left-wing activist, that your criticisms aren't about public health, that you're just here to attack the government for the sake of it. I mean, I suppose two parts of this question, like what's that been like, and what do you say to those critics who say that you should be interpreted as a political activist, not as an ex-director of public health?
Well, the first thing to say is I've had massive support from people in the community, massive support. But over the last 4 weeks, there has been a concerted effort to undermine my professional credibility, which has taken some very nasty forms, including complaints made about my behaviour to my professional colleges that I'm registered with. And, this has caused immense personal stress and mental stress and so on. And it's a lonely place out there when you're in this position. So, that's been a real problem. But I'm afraid my personality is I've always been driven by concern about injustice, social inequality. That's why I chose public health as a career. And public health has been described by, better people than me as the political wing of medicine. The House of Commons has been described as the pharmacy of public health. You can't divest politics from public health. These are big questions. They're big social questions. And what we saw here was politicians seeking to hide behind professionals. Unfortunately, there weren't enough real practical public health people involved in advising the government, and certainly with SAGE, but accusing me of politics when I was drawing on my over 40 years experience in public health. And yes, I have political views because I'm a citizen. I'm a citizen of this country. I am reasonably well educated. I've always been interested in politics as well as medicine and public health. And I hope that that enriches what I've got to offer to the public.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good answer. And it is very notable, isn't it, that the government really struggled to find anyone who will argue their case who isn't either, well, who works in public health or is a doctor or a nurse and isn't employed by them. The only doctors and nurses who speak positively of the government seem to be in their direct employ, so the chief scientific officers or whatever. John, I think we're going to let you go now. Thank you so much for your time this evening and your insight. I'd definitely like to get you back on soon to talk about how this crisis develops. And yeah, speak to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
What a great guy. I'm going to have some water and then we're going to talk about our next story. So, the Office for National Statistics today released data showing that up to the 8th of May, there have been 55,000 more deaths than usual in the UK since the start of the COVID-19 crisis. Equivalent statistics haven't yet been published in Italy, but it is looking likely that Britain will be shown to have the highest death toll in Europe. So now, given the government had more warning than Italy, made active decisions which have now cost lives, they are looking for people to blame. For a while, as we talked about a lot on this show a few weeks ago, it looked like the establishment were going to try and blame people breaking the lockdown rules, saying that the reason why the death toll keeps climbing is because there are too many people visiting a park when they shouldn't be, or spending too long walking outside on the pavement or whatever. The problem was that people were following the lockdown rules so precisely that that was no longer credible. So they've had to look for a different scapegoat. And now, at least this morning, it looks like they're turning on the scientists. Now, this is in a way not a surprise. They always justified all of their decisions by saying we're following the scientists, which did always, it was very obvious that this was going to happen, made the scientists very vulnerable, because if it all, fucked up, they would just say, well, it wasn't us, it was the scientists we follow. Anyway, let's look at a clip this morning. This is Therese Coffey. So she's Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. She was doing the media round this morning. So every morning you have one government minister who goes on all the shows, apart from Piers Morgan. We'll talk about that later, to put forward the government position. This is her speaking to Kay Burley on Sky.
I'm sure that they would also be saying, when this government has got it wrong, we would expect them to say so, a bit like President Macron did in France.
At the time, as I say, back in the middle of February, the view very clearly expressed was that the transmission challenge in care homes was not one.
Okay, but with hindsight, did you get it wrong? With hindsight, did you get it wrong?
You can only make judgments and decisions based on the information and advice that you have at the time.
Okay,
I recognise things like testing capacity. Well, if the science was wrong, advice at the time was wrong, I'm not surprised if people would then think we made a wrong decision.
If the advice at the time was wrong, I'm not surprised that people then think we made a wrong decision. So that's pretty clear, isn't it? That's not very subtle. She's saying if there was a wrong decision, it was because of faulty advice. Now, there are two, I think, very important points to make here. So one is about responsibility. Obviously, scientists only advise, the government decide. So the idea that they can now pass the buck and say it's got nothing to do with us what the government policy was, it's all about the scientists. No, you're called the government because you make the government policy. So the buck stops with you. And the second, and I think this is more important actually, is that if you accept that wrong decisions have been made and that wrong advice has been given, then surely what you should conclude from that is you are going to have to change the way you get advice. And the obvious thing to do there is say, if it seems like the advice we were receiving was too narrow, let's make SAGE broader. So SAGE is the key group of scientists that advise the government. Or at the very least, let's publish their advice in a timely fashion so that if there are faulty assumptions in it, like there were in the advice they got back in February and March, then they can be found before they cost thousands of lives. So, for example, if back in March, the behavioral advice, which said that people will never accept a lockdown, that was why they were going to accept 100,000 deaths. It might end up being more than that. We don't know, because they said, well, a lockdown's not an option. There are plenty of people who would have looked at that assumption and said, look, we've seen what's happened in Wuhan, we've seen what's happened in South Korea, we've seen what's happened in Italy. Why do you assume that Britons, when they see bodies piling up in the street, are going to be desperate to go out and socialize? It always seemed bizarre to me, but that was never published. So it was always very difficult to challenge. The government would just say, we are following the science. In a moment, I'm going to talk about how the scientists have kicked back. So obviously there has been a bit of a truce between the government and the scientists up to this point. They sort of go out and say exactly the same thing, but now the government are turning on the scientists. It's no surprise, really, that they are changing their tune also. But first, that wasn't the only notable intervention from Therese Coffey this morning. So, as I said, she was doing the whole media round. And on BBC Breakfast, she made another big claim. This time, it was notable not because she was trying to shift the blame, not because she was trying to scapegoat someone else, but because what she said was completely false. So this is Therese Coffey answering a question about the government's failure to meet its own testing targets.
Government cannot force people to book in and have tests, but the capacity is there. And again, the Health Secretary's announced even more eligibility for people who are showing symptoms, because let's remember, these tests that we have only really work on people who show symptoms to indicate whether or not they've actually got the virus. So it's not a case you just can test everybody with that particular test.
So there's a couple of things to note there. Remember, this is who the government have sent out this morning to go on all the shows, apart from Piers Morgan, to explain the government's position. And there's a couple of problems there. So first of all, I always find it a bit distasteful when they blame their failure for testing on people not getting enough tests. We can't force people to go and get tested. But that wasn't the point which was objectively false. If it was objectively false, as she says, these tests we have only really work on people that have symptoms. Now, that's simply not true. So first, you can test positive for coronavirus before the onset of symptoms, or even if you never develop them. So if you're an asymptomatic person, also the government know that. That's been admitted by them or never denied. Why would it be denied? And I mean, the most simple way of seeing this is that on the 1st of May, the government offered testing to all NHS staff with or without symptoms. So that was clearly a decision Coffey was unaware of, despite being sent out to defend the government, or just didn't understand. Secondly, and this is the more important one, is that testing asymptomatic people or pre-symptomatic people is the most important method of suppressing and controlling coronavirus. Why? Because it is when people are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic that they are most likely to pass on the infection. And it's obvious why, isn't it? If you feel like you've got a flu, you're more likely to stay in your house. If you don't, you're going to go outside. And people think that it's the pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission of coronavirus which has really driven this epidemic out of control. The whole principle, the whole point of mass testing is to stop that pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission. And we have a government minister sent out on TV who doesn't know the basics of this disease. I know she's the Department of Work and Pensions Secretary. We don't expect her to, know the genetic makeup of this virus. I don't even know if viruses have genes, but whatever. But we do expect her to know the basics of how a testing system is going to work. The basics. Obviously, because she was on BBC Breakfast, that mistake was not picked up. And that wasn't the only mistake she made that wasn't picked up. We are now going to go, as we often do, it's a bit embarrassing, but we're going to go to a clip of Piers Morgan, who was challenging an error which the BBC did not notice.
This is Theresa Coffey on BBC Breakfast. She's the Pensions Secretary.
We have increased the capacity hugely. I recognise that there have only been a handful of days where more than 100,000 people have gone for that test.
Right, so she recognises that there's only been a handful of days when more than 100,000 people have gone for a test. Theresa Coffey, if you were on our programme, if you had the guts to come on, I would have said to you, there's been no days. Zero. Nada. Nil. What you just said was a lie.
Explain why.
You just told BBC viewers that there have been a handful of days when over 100,000 people have been tested. No. There have been a handful of days when you've conducted, apparently, over 100,000 tests. There hasn't been a day when you have tested 100,000 people.
Because some people require 2, 3 tests.
Several tests to establish whether they're negative. So that's another government minister avoiding us, lying through her back teeth to the country about what they're doing with testing. And she's the one that said how proud she is of the testing.
So that's one 10-minute appearance on BBC Breakfast with Dan Walker. 2 lies. So the lie I just talked about, which was this idea that you can't test people if they don't have symptoms. And that second lie where she's saying there are many days when we tested over 100,000 people. There hasn't been a single day. There's been some days where they've claimed 100,000 tests have been done, even though that only involves posting them. But 2 lies, neither of them were called out. So who is that more embarrassing for? Is that more embarrassing for Therese Coffey, who's gone out defending the government, lying on a whim, or Dan Walker, the host of BBC Breakfast, who didn't call her out. And obviously I don't need to tell you why the government are not going on the Piers Morgan Good Morning Britain show, because they know that it will be a bit harder to lie than when they go on the BBC. I want to finish this section, sort of rounding it up by the backlash by the scientists against the government. So obviously, they're probably a bit concerned now that they kind of really went out batting for the government, and now it is being thrown back in their faces. The government are now trying to blame all of their mistakes on them. And I think some of these tensions were visible at today's daily press conference. So often these daily press conferences are quite dull. It was more interesting today because there was some real tension up on the platform. I want to go to one clip now. So it was George Eustice, the Environment Secretary, and Angela McLean, who's the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor. They were who were speaking in front of the press. And here is McLean's answer to a question as to whether the government were being premature in sending children back to school.
The scientists have been very clear in our advice that changes to lockdown, as we modelled them, need a highly effective track, trace and isolate system to be in place. And we're also very clear that any change to social distancing measures should be based upon observed levels of incidence in places that those are going to be changed, not on a fixed date.
Okay.
I made sure Fox included the awkward silence before George Eustice says okay, because there were some awkward comments there for the government, because the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor there is asked, are the government being premature in sending kids back to school on the 1st of June? And what does she say? She says, well, changes to lockdown need a highly effective track and trace system in place before it's safe. And what don't we have at this point? A highly effective track and trace system in place. And the government spokesperson actually yesterday told journalists that we can reopen schools even if the track and trace system isn't yet fully in place. So she's directly contradicting him. She also says, which is potentially, I think, more significant, she says changes to lockdown should be based on observable changes in prevalence of disease in the R rate and track and trace, not on arbitrary dates. So it sounds like she won't be endorsing sending kids back to school on the 1st of June. I wonder if there's going to be a new pattern emerging where they don't just stand up there and agree with everything the government says or cover for them. There's one more, though. So this is McLean responding to a question as to why many people are waiting over 2 weeks to get their coronavirus test results.
I think really running a rapid and reliable testing system is an entirely operational issue. And so the science advice would be you need to have a rapid and reliable testing system.
Okay.
There was one more bit, actually, but maybe we don't have the one more bit. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So she was saying there, she was asked, why is it taking some people, it was in Plymouth, the question was asked about, it's taking 2 weeks for them to get their test results back. She says, look, I mean, the scientific advice is to have test results that come back quickly. If they don't come back quickly, that's the government's problem. But we give the advice is to do it. The next bit was interesting as well, because when she was asked whether or not the government were capable of having a timely track and trace system, she said, well, it's kind of improving, but we have seen from other countries that it is possible to get it back within 48 hours. So one, she said, look, this has nothing to do with us if the testing system isn't working. Two, she said, we've looked at other countries and we can see that you can have a timely system where results come back in 48 hours, but we don't have that. So take that, Theresa Coffey. The scientists are fighting back. Although I wouldn't be surprised if it's a while before the government let Angela McLean back in front of the nation's media. We have 2,000 people watching tonight. Thank you for that. Hit that like button. And as ever, this platform is only possible because of your kind support. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or give us a super chat, or give us a one-off donation, a sort of lockdown bonus. That's if, obviously if you haven't lost your job. I don't need to talk about employment issues now, because I'm now joined by Faiza Shaheen.
Hello.
Economist, friend of the show, and director of Class Think Tank. How are you doing, Faiza?
All right, actually. Yeah, all right, considering all of the madness and how angry I feel at the government. But yeah, all right.
Because of employment issues or public health issues, or both?
I mean, I guess both, but yeah, more just the line. I just so fed up with it.
Yeah. So Pfizer's think tank Class has just released a new report, Coronavirus and the Workers' Emergency Labour Market Realities in 2020. So we're going to talk about that report alongside new employment data from the Office for National Statistics, which was released today, showing some of the extent of the crisis. So let's get up the first bit of information they put out. So the ONS show that unemployment measured by those claiming job seekers allowance has almost doubled to 5.8% or 2.1 million people since the lockdown began. Can we get this one up? We will be able to see that it's the highest it's been in over 20 years. Oh, there we go. So you can see it's popped up to 5.8%. That's 2.1 million people. And that's the highest it's been since it looks like about 97. But Pfizer, my question for you is that your survey, so as part of your report, you also did a survey which found that 6 million workers are worried they're going to lose their jobs in the next 6 months. So even though this 5.8% looks, big in terms of recent history, that could be, well, if these people are right, it could be tripling. Are people right to be worried that 6 million people could be losing their jobs, or is this people's perceptions as opposed to what's actually going to come along in the near future?
I mean, I think that what we heard today on statistics is just really a snapshot, because there's a time lag in the unemployment data. It just gives us a sense of what's to come. And one of the things that we can see in our survey and talking to trade unions and looking at things like what's happened with British Airways is that actually a lot of people are right to think that there is a question mark about whether their job will survive and they'll be able to have the same job that they have right now in 6 months' time. And either because, like aviation, things will so fundamentally change for them that, they're just going to make loads of people redundant, or they were going to do that anyway, and they're using the cover of the coronavirus pandemic to do that. Or because simply it's just going to take time for businesses to be up and running again. They'll let go of a few people, or they'll at least cut back to sort of part-time or very few hours. So, the reason why we ask workers what they think about what's going to happen to the labour market and to their jobs is because actually workers often have a very strong sense. They get the sense from their boss. They know how their company's doing, and they are, aware of what demands there are, how many customers they might have, or if they're in the public sector, they'll hear rumours about what is going to come. And really the whole idea of us doing this worker survey, which we do every year, is to counter just the sort of the business perspective and say, well, what do workers think? And actually it's important, not just because it's important to listen to workers' voices, but also because they are a credible source of information. Because if, as is the case, 20% or just under 20% of workers think, I might not have this job in 6 months' time, then guess what? They start altering what they buy. There's all kinds of ripple effects that happen to the economy because these people are insecure and they feel unconfident about what their position will be in months to come. And it really does demonstrate that the furlough scheme is just not enough on its own. It's a short-term measure, and we need to have a plan going forward.
I mean, as a short-term measure, let's focus on the furlough for a moment, because I mean, you work for a think tank which is related to the trade unions. Sort of part of the function of it is to sort of increase their impact and their role in society, or their voice. It seems like, I mean, on a superficial level, that the trade unions have actually been quite influential during this crisis. They seem to play a big role in pushing for this 80% furlough scheme. Now they've played a big role in its extension until October. To what extent are you seeing sort of like a completely different attitude from this Conservative government towards organised labour in the middle of this public health crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite something in those first few weeks of the lockdown to hear Rishi Sunak and others just to continuously mention that they've consulted unions and sometimes even to thank unions. And definitely, I know, because I was speaking to a lot of senior trade unionists, in those first few weeks, they had a big impact in terms of pushing for the furlough scheme, because honestly, the government didn't know what to do, so they had to listen. But what's also happening is they are still demonising unions. So look at the National Education Union, for instance, and what's happened over the last week. And there is a little bit of what I think is sort of, they're saying they're consulting unions, but they might have just sent them the guidance a few hours earlier. So it's not real, it's not really like they're taking unions in and they suddenly like really care about what they think. When they're in trouble, then they're looking to unions. But as soon as they can, they'll go back to vilifying them.
And so, I mean, to what extent do you think the support that's been given out, because the sums are huge here, to what extent do you think it is actually about supporting workers potentially under pressure from the trade unions? And to what degree is it just about, corporate slush funds? So, I mean, there was an IPPR report which was saying that 45% of all of this furlough money is going towards rent and mortgage payments. I mean, that's not quite a slush fund, but you can see, who this government support is disproportionately helping. I mean, we've also seen, the government offer rescue packages to BA and to the various airline industries. We might, think of these as industries which need dramatic reform. Is the government using this leverage to try and shift the economy in a more sustainable direction, or do you see this as them trying to, as much as possible, keep everything exactly the same as it was before March 2020?
I wish that they were, looking to move it in a more progressive green agenda. And if they were doing that, then they would be doing very simple things that other governments like France and Denmark are doing, which they're saying, when we bail you out, airline, you're going to have to meet these carbon targets, or we're going to buy a stake in this airline and we are going to push you to get much better in terms of your carbon footprint. They're saying to companies, you have to be paying your tax here. Our government isn't doing any of those things. It's not really trying to change the fundamentals. It's not trying to change normal. Normal being very, very damaging to people. I mean, one of the things that we see in the report, because we looked at the present, but we also looked at the past and we looked at the future to try and get a sense of what it is that needs to change. And one of the things that was really clear is that, we've gone into this crisis in a worse position than we did going into the financial crisis, because for the last 10 years, I'm not just talking about austerity, although of course that's a big part of it, systematically undermined workers' rights. And, the number of people on 0-hour contracts has gone from 200,000 to 1 million. And lo and behold, those are the first people that are being let go and being affected economically. So now when you look at it, and this is all I've been doing for the last few weeks, is looking at the numbers and looking also at what other countries are doing. The furlough scheme is just a short-term diversion, something they have to do, but the blueprint is still the same. The blueprint of what they want is still the same. There's no sense yet. I mean, we haven't had anything about a green stimulus or, any of those things, not even a hint of it. So, people talk about this is the end of neoliberalism and, things are really going to change. I want it to be, of course, but we still have a conservative government in charge. Ideologically, have to be quite different to choose a different path.
It's interesting you mentioned that green point, actually, because we've seen Ed Miliband actually come out with some quite ambitious policy, I think, in terms of I think he says we should have the most ambitious green agenda in the world. But whilst, given this is a Tory government, we don't really expect them to come out and say we have to, a condition of a bailout is that people have workers on boards and we're going to leave this crisis by giving organised labour much more power. Conservative governments don't do that. I could imagine this particular government putting a bit of a green spin on all of this. And for some reason, they don't seem to have even sort of in language and discourse, even mentioned sort of climate change during this whole period. It seems like that should be a bit of an open door to push on. I don't know why that hasn't happened.
I mean, one, they've just been constantly reacting. So the thing that you've noticed with Rishi Sunak is that he reacts and they make a mistake, or someone says, what about self-employed? And then they bring in a policy. I think in terms of climate, I mean, even it seems like a lifetime ago now, but even in his first budget, which was, just a couple of weeks before the pandemic and lockdown really became a thing, he didn't really talk about the climate in his budget at all. I mean, it's just not a priority for them. There's so much that could be done right now, and I'm glad that Ed Miliband came out with that plan. But, again, when we look at our data and we look at the levels of inequality entrenched and getting worse because of the coronavirus, We need a plan for green jobs, and we also need to look very much at care. So, we need to have, I would say, a green and care-led recovery plan, because also there's all kinds of issues of gender and low pay. And, if nothing else, we can't just end the clapping and then let care workers go back to what they've been putting up with all this time.
My next question relates to sort of one less impressive Labour policy. So the Ed Miliband Green New Deal was good, the rental policy bad. But this relates, I think, to your the survey you did. So the survey you commissioned found 60% of workers are at most 3 months away from rent or mortgage default. And so if this crisis deepens, if unemployment rockets, I think there's really one of three options for the government. So one is you have rent and debt forgiveness so that people don't default, or you have a massive upping of benefits so that people can afford to pay their mortgage or their rent, even if they become unemployed, or you have mass evictions. So I suppose, one, do you think that's a correct assessment of the forks ahead? And which do you think this government is most likely to take? And how do you see the Labour Party sort of navigating that particular future? Because at the moment, it seems like they aren't really rising to that particular challenge.
No, it's been really disappointing on rents, and I know that you covered it before. I think when you look at both the levels of insecurity in the labour market, who's losing their jobs, who's been most affected, which is disproportionately people on lower incomes, women, ethnic minorities, and self-employed, and people in precarious work. And you put that alongside what our survey shows on how close people are to the edge. They're just hanging on with their fingertips. A third are just 1 month away. So 60% are 3 months away, a third are just 1 month away. And you can imagine even a switch from a full-time job to universal credit, which is, nothing. That puts a lot of people in real binds. What they have right now is they'll cover 30% of market rents. It's not that, if you've got a really low level of rent, then maybe you'll be covered, but otherwise not. And, a lot of people find themselves in real hot water. And I think rents in particular, because a lot of people have taken mortgage holidays, although those are due to come to an end. So we'll see what happens over the summer as well, alongside the phasing out of the furlough program. We really, the easiest thing for the government to do is to say, we'll pay rents. Because the question is, people, obviously renters are saying we can't afford to do this. If the government said, just don't pay your rents, there are some issues that could happen with landlords and legally and the rest of it. But you can't have a situation whereby those with mortgage holders are allowed to take a 3-month holiday. Barely anything.
I'd have thought because of the holiday, the government shouldn't necessarily have to subsidise the whole rent. So you can say that the homeowner has to take some loss. I mean, maybe the renter takes a bit of loss and the government takes a bit of loss. I don't see why it can't be shared out.
You could play on it to some extent.
Yeah. My next question is about strategy. But before I ask that, if you do have any questions, now is the time to tweet them on the hashtag TiskiSour or put them in the comments with a rocket emoji. My next question is about strategy, and especially sort of like in your role as part of a trade union think tank. So I think also in your report, you found that there is, big support for progressive changes. So over 2/3 of workers support taxing the wealthiest more, and 67% support increasing investment in public services. So this looks positive right now. But obviously, the government strategy and the strategy of the establishment is to try and shift the narrative before this crisis is over. So many people thought in 2008 that the financial crisis would lead to a shift left in politics. But at that point in time, it didn't really seem like the left were in a position to step up. In that moment of crisis, we didn't provide the ideas. And who ended up providing the ideas was George Osborne and people talking about strivers and skivers and using that crisis not as an excuse to regulate. Well, they were never looking for an excuse to regulate capitalism, but not as a moment to regulate capitalism, but as an excuse to further sort of attack the poor and shift our economy more in favor of the already very rich and wealthy. Do you think the left are in a better position now than they were in 2008 to fight this battle and not lose it as disastrously as we did just over a decade ago?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the early part of my career when that happened, and it was almost like unbelievable because the whole country was completely gaslighted about austerity and what had happened with the financial crisis. I think we are in a better position. I think there are more left voices, more left organizations doing the work. You know, every day there's various different studies coming out from whether it's NEF or IPPR or, you know, there are ideas that are out there. But one of the things I'm concerned about is that we don't have a strategy in terms of the way in which we communicate those ideas. So there's lots of support for green investment. There's lots of support for public investment. But at the same time, how are we really going to mobilize that support going forward? There's not going to be a political moment anytime soon. And so I don't think we have a strategy in terms of how to build broader kind of social movement in this time when there isn't an election. I think in the general, we've been quite rubbish at that on the left. But I also feel, that we just don't get the language right. You know, we get too technical. Like, I want to be able to talk about what needs to happen to workers' voice. And then I might get the odd message saying, oh, you should have spoke about sectoral collective bargaining. Of course, I think we should have sectoral collective bargaining, but no one knows what that means. And we don't have the language to speak about it. And you know, we're still failing there, I think. And also, you know, really to have a hymn sheet that we all speak from, and that's really important at this time. I mean, one of the things I would say that I think is working, that people are angry about, is the term low skilled. So one of the things that I wrote in the report is that I just delete it from the political lexicon. It's just, you know, it's the commodification of people in the labour market is so extreme. I mean, the labour market in itself, you know, it's that term, a market. I think that's somewhere where we can talk about the value of work and that you're not paid your value to society. And I think that's somewhere that the left can really galvanise and get people talking. You know, years ago when I worked at NEF and I was young, and there was this report called A Bit Rich, and we actually worked out, the researchers actually worked out what your social value is for your job versus what you're paid. And so for every £1 you're paid as a hospital cleaner, you have huge social value. Whereas for every £1 you're paid as a banker, you know, have minus social value. And it just got so much attention, and there were talk shows on the radio, and cleaners were calling up and saying, yeah, this is true. And I just don't think we're very good at really connecting our ideas and our narrative back to people so they can really feel part of it. And I think we're still lacking on that strategy.
Although you say that's where I feel kind of positive about what might be the aftermath, what might come after this, is that the difference between the financial crisis and the coronavirus crisis, in terms of the government response and the societal response to them, is that the financial crisis only had villains, and also it was sometimes quite hard to understand what the villains had done. It was all, you know, very technical. This coronavirus crisis has heroes, and those heroes are precisely the people who you would want to center in a new progressive economy. So not just doctors and nurses, but also people who stack shelves, bus drivers, precisely the kind of heroes on whom you want to build a new, more progressive and more egalitarian society. So it's it gives the left so much more material to work with, and such a more obvious sort of protagonist in the fight for a better economy.
Right, we still had the immigration bill yesterday. So I agree. I think there's a lot there that we can push, but this government, I don't see any kind of real shift in this government, and we've gone back to using the term low skilled as well. So there's so much work for us to do. There's so much that we need to fight for right now.
That is a very good note to end the show on. Faiza Shaheen, it is always an absolute pleasure to have you on Novara Media. Keep up the good work.
You too.
And thank you everyone for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then you can go to novaramedia.com/support. We do appreciate it. We'll be back on Wednesday night, or Tiski Sal will be back on Friday night, but Aaron Bastani is back tomorrow. He's going to be interviewing Rutger Bregman. So a very big interview, big Novara Media event. Tune in tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I've been Michael Walker. You've been watching Tiski Sour. Good night.